I'm Sandro Carrara. I'm working in EPFL. EPFL is the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, a kind of technical institute of technology. In Switzerland, there are two institutes of technologies. Actually, the most famous is in Zurich, ETH, and the second most famous is in Lausanne, the EPFL. We are just located in front of the Léman Lake, which is the Lake of Geneva, and in front of the French Harbor. The campus has been founded in 1853, and it has evolved trying to attract top researchers and professors all around the world. It became ranked at position 16 in the world of technical university. And the campus is mainly shared by 10,000 students per year. Roughly speaking, 8,500 are undergraduate students and 1,500 are PhD students. So today we're gonna speak about technologies for an implantable nano-bio-sensing laboratory. I mainly collected, in preparing this tutorial, research results we obtained with my group over the last 4 or 5 years. And the final point is to develop a technology that should go under the skin in order to address the possibility to measure molecules in the human body. The problem we try to address here with this kind of technologies is the fact that once we are treating different patients with exactly the same pharmacological cure, the same pharmacological treatment, we typically get opposite results out of the same patient group. So let's imagine we have the same disease. To identify one molecule which is the right one, we suppose, to cure the patients. In some cases, our treatment is beneficial and not toxic, but we may have other cases out of the same patient sample. And the worst case, of course, is to have the drug which is not beneficial at all, but unfortunately even toxic. And this fact is reflected in the low rate of success that we obtain in pharmacological cure, down to only 25% of success, typically in chemotherapeutic treatments, considering cancer in general. Of course, the reason because different patients react so different in a so different manner with respect to the same treatment is because they are different at the genetic level. All of us are different, so are different also in treating in our body the pharmacompounds. We have differences among us at genetic level, at epigenetic level, but also at daily variation of our metabolism. Of course, the system biology tried to explain all this complex mechanism of our metabolism in order to let us understand how it's complex and why, at the end, it is so different patients by patients. But unfortunately, it does not provide us a simple approach to manage all these differences. And here the dream of any oncologist, or in general any pharmacologist, is to have an easy and cheap technology to be just in front of the patient bed, to have the possibility to drop a small sample of the patient's blood in a handable machinery that costs no more than $50, to read in few seconds, let's say maximum 1 minute, the amount of the molecule into the patient's blood before deciding the next injection of the compounds. Why it's so important? It's so important for the pharmacologist to know the amount of the compounds in the patient's blood, because the compounds is injected by the patients is spooled out by the body within a time frame of hours. And of course it usually follows this kind of curve after the injection. And this is called the pharmacokinetics of the compounds that have been provided to the patients. And as you can see in this graph, there is a good range in which that is called a therapeutic range, where the compound is effective, and there is a below the minimum concentration, the compound is not effective anymore, and if the concentration overcome the maximum level of the therapeutic range, we enter in the toxic dose for the patients. And this is a general feature of our metabolism with pharma compounds that run for all of us. So I said why it is important to know patient by patient the pharmacokinetics, because two different patients may have two completely different pharmacokinetics. In this cartoon you can compare, let's say, a normal metabolizer with a fast metabolizer. In some cases, even with the same dosage, we can have two different peaks. In the first case, you see that the patients overcome the toxic dose, and you go very fast below the minimum amount to be effective. And of course, this is important to be known, because usually we need to supply the patients with another amount of the compound before going below the minimum effective value. But once again, if we choose in a badly manner the moment of the second injection, even with the proper amount, we can let the patients overcome and enter in the danger zone. So it's crucial to know exactly in that patient how is the amount of the drug into the blood in order to tune the right moment for the second injection. I would like you to think, just to have a clear idea of what we are saying now, to think to chemotherapeutic compounds. They are probably the most terrible treatment we know in the world. So they are in any case toxic. The idea is to kill only the cancer cells, but of course they are in any case toxic, and so adjust the right amount patient by patient may be really crucial in order to avoid to kill with the treatment the patients, and on the other side to address correctly the therapy. Another dream worldwide in the world is to have kind of technology directly implantable in the human body, connected with a drug dispenser, in order to have the possibility to read continuously online the amount of the drug in the tissue that we are monitoring for the cure. Of course, we might be interested to measure the disease biomarker as well, in order to correlate the cure and the progress of the disease. And of course, we would like to have a technology that can online made out an analysis of the red concentration above the drugs and the disease marker before having an automatic delivery of the right amount of the compound. Of course, it's part of this, let me call it dream, but it became in reality year by year, with a really great advancement in the worldwide effort, technological worldwide effort. Another part of this idea, of this dream, is to spread all over in our body several kinds of sensors. Of course, the paradigm is to have these sensors so thin and so light to be almost not felt, to be almost hidden to our conscious thinking, including, of course, measurements of ECG or EEG, respiration, blood pressure, but also molecular measurements like glucose, DNA, protein, or toxins that we may have in our system. Okay, the best of this idea is that the day we will be really able to do that, we can connect all of us, in principle even fully healthy people, in order to prevent disease. But once more, we can connect elderly people or chronic patients to the healthcare system through internet, and so opening the possibility to treat also the patients at home in order to drastically reduce the healthcare costs that they are skyrocketing, even following the increasing of the over 60 people that are typically present in the West countries. Okay, this is perfect. We want to reach that point. But now the question is, if we want to measure molecules in our body, we need to have a look at what is the state of the art of the technology for measuring molecules. Let us consider just a few gold examples we can find in the market. For example, the system called Glutamate B by Menarini, or the system called Freestyle Navigator by Abbott, as well as the MidMed Guardian by Medtronic, or the 7 Plus by Dexcom. In this cartoon, we have at least 3 really top players worldwide in this kind of technology. However, the state-of-the-art technology is still fairly limited, because in all the cases we've already seen tubing through the skin, which is of course painful and a great source of inflammation in the region where we have the tubing. All this technology address only one disease, the diabetes, and not the diabetes at large, but the diabetes mellitus type 1, and they are only measuring the glucose. So in opposite, if we want, as we described before, address drugs and address metabolites at large, the idea is to develop a multi-panel platform that can, of course, address the human metabolism at large. So not only measuring the glucose, but also measuring other relevant metabolites. We can think to immobilize different kind of probe enzymes in the different sensors that we can put in our platform in order to detect not only the glucose, but other metabolites, like for example lactate, which is an extremely important metabolite in case of critical patients, cholesterol, which is another important metabolite connected to a huge series of cardiovascular diseases. ATP, you know, it's a currency of energy of cells, so for sure another top important metabolite also associated to inflammation. And last but not least, if we want to address personalized medicine, personalized therapies, if we want, as we said before, adjust the amount of the pharma compound to the single patients, we need also to measure drugs. So now the question is how to do that, to have a look if we have possibility to exploit new technologies for doing that. Let us start with how to detect drugs. So drugs are, as we said before, a molecule that we inject with the idea to address one disease or to interact with our metabolism, but they are fed by our body always as alien compounds. So when we inject a compound, the body immediately starts a reaction in order to try to spool down the compounds. And that's the reason we have the pharmacokinetics. We inject an antibiotics, and we do not have forever the antibiotics in our body, but it is, as we said, in ours, injected by our body. Why that? Because there is a family of, the reason is because we have a metabolism that play with the compounds in order to bring out by our body. And part of this, in general, complex metabolic pathway is the presence of an enzyme. There is a family of proteins called the family of the cytochromes P450 that have more than 3,000 different isoforms. That means more than 3,000 different proteins. In this cartoon, we have just one example, the isoform 2B4 that can catalyze the bensphetamine by bringing one oxygen molecule and 2 coenzymes, the NADPH and 1 proton, and getting the molecule, the drug, in the oxidized form. This has been selected by the evolution of mammalians because the oxidized form is much more soluble, then faster to be secreted. Don't forget that's an alien compounds we want to have out as soon as we can. But for our aim, this catalytic reaction is so important because it's a redox reaction. And in particular, the presence of the two coenzymes are there because they are providing two electrons every drug transformation. And so, in principle, we can furnish these electrons from our electrodes, counting it, and knowing that every two electrons we have one drug molecule. So we count the electrons, we divide by 2, and we know exactly how many molecules of our drug we will have having in our sample. So we can have drug detection by measuring, in principle, a current furnished to this redox system. Okay, as you can imagine, this is not an absolutely new idea. Over the last 10, 15 years, several authors published about that. This is just one example, one antihypertensive compound called verapamil. And this is a calibration curve. So as you can see, current versus concentration of the verapamil as done by using the isoform 3A4 of the cytochrome P450. However, almost all the published data, the data published in literature, also including some of my papers, are in the millimolar range of the concentration. Now, if we want to really develop a real technology to address the detection of the molecules into the patient's blood, we need to compare this sensitivity with what is the amount found in the real patient tissue. And in the case of verapamil, the bad news is that we need to address below 1 micromolar. So that means that if the sensor we are building present the calibration curve I showed you before, there are no room for business with this kind of technology. So let us consider what is the reason because we have so limited detection with our sensor. One of the reasons, of course, is that we have a tunneling barrier in between the redox system we have on top of our electrodes and our electrodes. So between the Fermi level of the electrons in our electrode and the lowest unoccupied molecular orbital of our molecular system, we have typically a tunneling barrier which is limiting the electron transfer between our electrodes and the redox reaction we have mediated by the enzyme. So we need to develop any smart idea to improve the electron transfer. One possibility is try to use carbon nanotubes, mainly because they are structuring the surface, so highly increasing the active area of our electron, of our electrochemical electrodes. Another reason is that they support ballistic conductivity, so the flow of electron inside the nanotubes is practically like in vacuum, so we can hope to have a huge increasing of the electron transfer between our electrodes and our electrochemical couple. Over the year, there has been several experiments that demonstrated that we can consider, for example, screen-printed electrodes, typically used for electrochemical detection, including that of glucose. The scanning electron micrograph of this kind of carbon-passed electrode looks like that. And we can drop cast, we can simply transfer on top of this electron's carbon nanotube, and after the evaporation of the solvent, we obtain this kind of carbon nanotube forests. And then we can repeat this, the same operation to drop cast on our electrode our enzymes, and as you can see, the feature of the carbon nanotube slightly change. We can measure the diameter of the carbon nanotube fiber before and after the biofunctionalization, and we can of course compare this size that range from roughly speaking 10 nanometer up to 20 nanometer with the expected size of the enzymes. In this example, we have the cytochrome P450, which is a metalloprotein. You can recognize here the heme group of the proteins, and it is roughly speaking not exactly a ball, a bit more a pieces of cake. But what you can see is that the size are close to 4 or 5 nanometers, so that means that the increase in the apparent size of carbon nanotube corresponds to a single layer of protein just surrounding every carbon nanotube fiber. So we can imagine to have transferred on our electrodes the carbon nanotube and have functionalized with the coating of a single layer of the protein. Of course, our aim is not to decorate the electrodes, but to improve the performance of our sensor. And we can just have a look to this graph. This graph summarizes the detection of a very well-known anti-cancer compound, the cyclophosphamide, as detected by using, again, the isoform 3A4 of the cytochrome P450. And as you can see, we get two calibration curves, but in case we do not include in the electrochemical interface the nanotubes, we reach a limit of detection that is beyond once again, the therapeutic range we would like to address in case of cyclophosphamide. While we can indeed succeed in fitting the required windows of concentrations if we had in our electrochemical interface the multi-wallet carbon nanotube. So in this example, the use of carbon nanotube made a difference sorry, friends that come to say me hello. Great friends, Italian friends, opposite side of the world, do not succeed even in getting in Baltimore, sorry. So this graph shows that the presence of the carbon nanotubes, the electrochemical interface really put us in the condition to really succeed in getting the detection of the cyclophosphamide in the concentration we found in patients. But these experiments are typically lab experiments, so we use to detect cyclophosphamide in PBS, which is a buffer. So that means that we are not measuring the compounds into the patient's blood, but we are just using a bit of water, a bit of salt, and exactly the molecule we want to detect, which is not so fair. So when we work with the patients and with the patient's blood, we have tons of other molecules that can interact with our sensor. So, okay, this is a good demonstration of a principle, but now the point is to see if we can really run the business with the patients. And to demonstrate that, we move it from PBS to the human blood, especially to the human serum, that is what's remaining in the blood when we remove all the cells. And as expected, you can see we lost in terms of limit of detection. The cyclophosphamide moved from 2 micromolar up to 14 micromolar. We have almost one order of magnitude in terms of the loss we obtain moving from a lab sample to a sample with the human blood. However, luckily for us, the new limit of detection enables us to still address the expected pharmacological range in the human blood. And we repeated that not only for cyclophosphamide, but also for other 3 important anti-cancer compounds like phosphamide, phtorafate, and etoposide. However, life is never easy. And on the track of developing the technology for that, we met another serious problem, another fatal problem. And the fact that in all the pharma treatment we receive, we never got one compound at a time, but we usually got more compounds. This is just an example of cocktails used in anti-cancer treatment. You can see that there is a mixing of typically 3 different compounds. If you, by chance, go to have a look of what it is written, even in antibiotics that our doctors suggested us when we have a kind of bacterial inflammation, you see that we have usually more than one active principle. Active principle means kind of molecules that are active against our disease. So we need to play with different compounds at the same time. And this is for sure a problem for the cytochrome P450 enzymes because they are not so specific. They are a kind of protein that has been evolved by mammalians, has been, let's say, developed by the mammalian evolutions with the same principle of antibodies. So I don't know if you are aware, but we have different kind of antibodies that have to bring their working just against any possible compound, any possible molecule that we may inject by chance. The cytochrome has been developed with the same idea by the evolution, so it's a flexible protein that can play, can roll, can transport several substrates, as we say in biochemistry. So let us consider one example, just by keeping a good publication from Johnson published in 2005. The isoform 2C9 may detect not only the torsemide but also the diclofenac, tolbutamide, and other compounds. So now the question from the perspective to develop a sensor or a set of sensors for measuring this drug is how to cope with this complex situation. Luckily, it seems that the Faradaic current related to the working process of the enzymes, which is located at minus 41 millivolts once the enzyme is working typically on an electrolyte like PBS plus KCl. The peak, the Faradic current, slightly shift in the presence of the substrate. So, for example, it remains at minus 41 for the diclofenac, but if the substrate is the torsemide, it shifts to minus 19. So we can think to have the chance to decouple the current we acquire by making a sweeping in the voltage in the charging current, which is not informative for our drug, and in the Faradic currents, thinking that we will have different currents coming from the different contributions, and you can imagine to decouple the different contributions by Gaussians, and so in principle nothing special on the side of the signal analysis. However, once again, the life is not so easy, and what happens is that, okay, the same enzymes may cope with different drugs, with different molecules, but the presence of one molecule can interfere with the detection of another. Let us just consider two opposite examples. There are some intermediate situations, the case of the heteroactivation and the case of the partial inhibition. In the first case, if we have one enzyme that does not detect a drug, let's say the one, it may happen that with the presence of a second drug, even the first may become detectable. The reason of that is the protein is a complex molecule. It has an active site in between. It is the site of the protein where the redox reaction I showed you before is occurring. But of course, the drug needs to reach this active site. It may be that the right pathway for let D1 enter the enzyme is closed, and only in the presence of a second drug that is using another pathway, this second drug is entering the enzyme. The enzyme, because it's a very complex protein, can can go to rearrange its structure and open, for example, the pathway for the drug D1, which can finally reach the active site. So the presence of D1 enable us to detect also the presence of D2 enable us also to detect D1. The opposite case is the case in which one drug is very well detected, but in presence of another drug, it became poorly detectable. This, of course, cope with the fact that the two drugs can compete on the same active site. I would like just to show you from the perspective of the sensing these two opposite cases. This is the simultaneous detection of cyclophosphamide and dextromethorphan. Dextromethorphan is an anti-cough compound. They both are detected by the isoform 3A4. You can see that we can clearly distinguish two different peaks into the sample. However, if we fix the concentration of cyclophosphamide at 400 micromolar, and if we vary only the dextromethorphan in our sample, we get variation in the peak related of the dextromethorphan, but also we observe different current on the peak of cyclophosphamide. So in this case, the presence of the dextromethorphan have inhibited partially the detection of the cyclophosphamide. The opposite example is that of naproxen and flupyprofen. There are two very well-known anti-inflammatory compounds. I'm sure all of us already use it at least once in our life. They are detectable by using the enzyme 2C9 we considered before. Once again, you can clearly see two very well-defined peaks at two different locations in the voltammograms. But once again, if we fix at 200 micromolar the concentration of one of the two, and if we vary only the second one, we get an increasing of the peak corresponding to the naproxen, which is varying in concentration. But we got also increased current for the same concentration of flupyprofen. So the presence of naproxen activated the detection of flupyprofen. So that means we cannot simply decouple in independent Gaussians related to the different contribution, but we need to take into account that the amplitude of each Gaussian dealing with a single drug will depend by the concentration of the other drugs into the sample. So we need to consider that we need to address this, to use the technology to develop multi-panel platforms where we can foresee different enzymes, and we need to recall that different substrate, different drug may be detected by different enzymes, as well as the same enzyme can detect two different drugs. Of course, we can, if we are lucky, to distinguish, as I showed you, the different Faradic current, but we definitely need to introduce more intelligence in our biochip. We need to cope with a much more complex detection, not only a single sensor that assures us specificity on a single molecule. This is just to show you one example of what we are saying. We can develop a four-fold platform with four independent electrochemical sensors. In one, we can immobilize only carbon nanotube, in another, the carbon nanotube plus one isoform, and choosing the other two different isoforms for the third and the fourth sensors. With only the carbon nanotube, you can detect the etoposide because it's a highly electrochemical active compound. With the 3A4, we can detect these three drugs, cyclophosphamide, etoposide, and phosphamide, with the isoform 1A2, phthoraful, and etoposide, and with the last, cyclophosphamide and phosphate. So as you can see, but the first case, we have interaction of all the sensors by different drugs. How to cope with that? How to decouple the different contributions? Of course, we are in front of a multiple calibration curves. And for example, if we want to detect the phosphate, and if we have different value of etoposide, we cannot be sure if we measure, I don't know, 0.15 microampere of current, which concentration we are facing. And the reason is we don't know what is the amount of the etoposide, which is interacting with the detection of the phosphate. So we can consider another sensor. In this sensor, we can see that although the different curves are not exactly overlapping, they are statistically speaking not different each other. So we can measure a current here, for example, 50 microampere, and deduce that you are facing 50 micromolar or etoposide. So going back to the previous sensor, identify the right calibration curve and come up with the solution that we are just facing 100 micromolar of phosphate. So it's much more complex, but it's possible to repeat with the other drug, and so that means we can develop multi-panel platform with a series of query in time of the same platform in order to decouple the different compounds. In the example I showed you, we can first query the sensor without enzyme or with a 2B6, and then deduce the amount of phosphate and etoposide, and then in a second time query the other two sensors, and knowing what is the amount of etoposide coming with the right quantification of phthorafil and cyclophosphamide. Okay, this was the story of the drug, which is really complex, but we can have enough, let's say, room to cope with this complexity. What's about with the endogenous metabolites, which are typically related to the disease we would like to address? In this case, it's in general more simple because several of endogenous metabolites have the right oxidase that transform only that metabolite. So we can have the glucose oxidase, the lactate oxidase, the cholesterol oxidase. Just to mention how they work, even in this case, the oxidase bring the metabolites, bring one oxygen, and transform the metabolite in a product of the reaction, typically the glucose in gluconic acid or the lactate in pyruvate, just to mention two. But what is common in all this transformation is that at the end we also get hydrogen peroxide, which is again an electrochemically active compound. So when it goes in contact with our electrodes, it releases 2 electrons. That means, once again, we can count these electrons and have an estimation of how much metabolite, glucose or lactate or whatever was connected to the oxidase we are using was in our sample. As you can imagine, even in this case, carbon nanotubes greatly, largely improve the performance of our sensor. This is just one example on glucose. Up to 4 millimolar, we measure practically negligible current, not out of the noise, if we do not have any mediator in the interface. If we use just multi-wallet carbon nanotube, we get 14 microampere for 4 micromolar of the glucose. And of course, we repeated several, we can demonstrate several similar improvement by detecting lactate or glutamate or dopamine or other endogenous metabolites. Unfortunately, for not all the endogenous metabolites, we are so lucky. So there are metabolites that do not have the oxidase, the right oxidase, or if they have, the oxidase is not an oxidase that produces hydrogen peroxide, and that is not active in terms of electrochemical redox reaction. So how to measure these metabolites? Let us consider the example of the ATP. In case of the ATP, we can develop a quite more complex membrane, sensing membrane, involving not only the glucose oxidase, but also the glucose hexokinase. Why to do that? Because both are using the glucose. The glucose hexokinase transform the glucose together with the ATP and produce the glucose 6-phosphate. But if we have in the membrane also the glucose oxidase, we have seen before that the glucose oxidase consumes glucose using oxygen, and as much the glucose hexokinase consumes glucose, as less we have available for the oxidase. We consume much more glucose with the hexokinase as much we have ATP. So, in principle, because the second reaction produces hydrogen peroxide, and we can measure the electrons coming from the hydrogen peroxide, we have an indirect manner to measure the ATP. We can measure, in any case, a current here which is related to the concentration of our ATP into the sample. This is just one example in time. If we have our membrane, our sensor developed both involving oxidase and hexokinase, as much we inject ATP into the solution, as less current we observe with our sensor. Of course, the fee we have to pay is the fact that if we have a different value of glucose in our sample, we will cope with a different calibration curve. But it's just enough in a multi-panel platform to have another sensor that just measures the glucose and to use this second measurement to calibrate the first, as well as we have done with the drugs. So, okay, all these are wonderful technology we can use to play or to I don't know, to develop a project, master project, or we can try to develop a technology that addressed the problems we have discussed at the very beginning. So a telemetry of the human metabolism. So in this case, what we can do is to try to develop different biosensor, molecular biosensor that is spread under the skin in our body. And we can think to get in a communication this chip with a wearable station. All of us are having in the pocket our mobile phone, so we can use smartphone to get connectivity with our sensor, and then of course be brought in contact with the remote hospital system, opening the possibility to telemonitoring of different patients. But of course the key point is to develop the thin lab under the skin. How to do it? The idea of this project was to develop a very and extremely thin biochip, complex multi-panel biochip, to be located under the skin, and in particular to address it in order to be minimally invasive, so as small we can. So if we want to be free to reduce dramatically the size of the device and to achieve the size of let's say a large surgery needle, we cannot use batteries because we do not have, with the state of the art in the battery, so thin batteries. So what we thought it was to develop a kind of patch that we can put on top of the skin, because on the patch we can host an antenna that can transmit power to the implant and of course receive back data. And on the patch, we have much more space to host both batteries and all the electronic we may need in order to connect and to transmit the received data to our smartphone. So the core of the system is, of course, this thin lab under the skin, as by the title of this tutorial. How we designed that? We started by considering a silicon substrate and developing our electrochemical sensor on top. In our design, we included 5 molecular sensors, and I will show you very soon that we also need to calibrate for pH and for temperature. Otherwise, we can get a shift in our Faraday current, and if we do not control this shift, we misunderstand the concentration we are estimating. I will show you that we develop a multi-layer receiving coil in order to receive enough power, as well as the electronics we need, both for the front end and for managing data and power transmission. What it was very challenging of this project, it was to cope with the size, the spec related to the size. So the idea was to develop a device that was really a thin device, maximum 2 millimeters in thickness and in height, and long, maximum a couple of centimeters. So what we need to address if we want to succeed in this ride, of course, we need to find a way to obtain a good integration between carbon nanotube and our biochip. We need to provide a precise current measurement if we want to decouple the different contribution of the different molecule on the sensor. We need to manage multiplexing different molecules to be reliable in temperature and pH, to also multiplexing the sensor for pH and temperature, and to be reliable in a voltage sweep. Last but not least, we need to find the energy in a different way but batteries. So let us now see very briefly one by one all these points we need to address in developing our technology. First of all, how to integrate carbon nanotube in a so thin device. Of course, we cannot do by hand. We cannot drop cast by a Gilson pipette. One possibility is to use commercially available micro-spotter. So the idea is to use this technology, which is available typically for spreading DNA and proteins, which is based on the micro needles that should be precisely located on a position on our chip. The resolution of the robot we have in the lab is 550 microns, so we can in 500 per 500 microns we can be quite precise in the location. The only problem here is that this technology is based on water solutions, while carbon nanotubes are highly hydrophobic, and in water they are sticking together. You get any more a forest I showed you before, but you get an enormous bundle of carbon nanotubes. So the solution here was to monodispersed carbon nanotube in Nafion in order to have a monodispersed solution of carbon nanotube and Nafion in water. And we succeed. You can probably recognize some drop with multiple droplet. We succeed in covering our electrode with our carbon nanotube. This is a scanning electron micrograph where you can probably recognize some carbon nanotube fibers. Meanwhile, you see also some Nafion particles. We also tried in the lab another approach, the electrodeposition of carbon nanotube. Even in this case, we use we need to cope with water-soluble mixtures. So we get a mixture by using multi-wallet carbon nanotube and another water-soluble polymer, the ketazone. Then, in this case, by applying a potential to our working electrode, we can establish a variation of pH, a gradient of pH that forces the ketazone to condense to the electrode, and in doing that, the ketazone traps all our carbon nanotube. And also in this case, the final result is transferred carbon nanotube in our microfabricated electrodes. This is just a comparison between what we obtain with the drop casting. As you can see, there is no so high precision in this kind of round electrodes, while with the electrodeposition we obtain a much better coverage only of the required region. Of course, this borderline deposition can result in shortcuts, so it's a kind of dangerous for our technology. And now, if we analyze the kind of the obtained forest, we see that we obtain a similar result we obtained before in the case of drop casting. However, don't forget we still have the polymer in this case covering our carbon nanotube. But the best results we obtained by using the chemical vapor deposition. Some of you that is more aware about that know that is very well known. We can grow carbon nanotube both in semiconductor and in metals. The only problem is that they grow everywhere. So if you design a multi-pallet platform and you have, I don't know, platinum electrode and passivation, nitrate or oxide passivation, at the end of the growth you obtain carbon nanotube everywhere. So it was a bit painful for the poor PhD student working on this task, but she is very smart and at the end succeeded in getting exactly what she would like to have. So carbon nanotube only on the sensor and not shortcutting one sensor with another. So the final procedure was, as usual, to heat a chamber where she inserted the multi-panel platform after a deposition of the catalyst by electrochemical deposition only on the working electrode. Then she used, as usual, argon and hydrogen to obtain a bit of annealing for 10 minutes of the catalyst. And then by using these two carriers, she injected carbon in the chamber in order to obtain the growth of carbon nanotube. We obtained not only carbon nanotube, but also graphene nanoflowers, and also structures that are a mixture between graphene nanoflowers and carbon nanotubes. Another important thing to be mentioned here is that the usual fabrication are in this range, use this range of temperature in the growing chamber, and this is not compatible with the CMOS electronics. We are burning our electronics, while our final aim is to develop a process that should be really CMOS compatible in order to have the possibility to grow nanostructure on our CMOS circuitry. And just after, as I said, a bit of pain, just adjusting the condition and repeating several times the experiment, we succeed in getting also the right condition for obtaining the same kind of fabrication at 450 degrees, which allow us to transfer this technology also in CMOS IC direct. As I said, we deposit the iron by electrodeposition, then we put this structure on the chamber, and we obtain a typically different kind of structure, carbon nanotube, that looks like really like what we have by drop casting, or flowers of graphene, graphite, and similar kind of carbon-based materials. Very briefly, we can compare the different material we obtain, a different kind of nanostructure at the electrode, drop casting, micro-spotting, electrodeposition, and chemical vapor deposition growth. Of course, we can keep just the glucose detection as an example and compare sensitivity and limit of detection, kind of nanotechnology per technology. In the first case, we obtain 27.7 micron per millimeter, micron per millimolar centimeter square. While, for example, with the micro-spotting, we obtain only 0.46, and the almost 2 orders of magnitude in difference in between the two technologies is mainly due to the fact that we are less efficient in the number of carbon nanotubes that we succeed in transferring on the platform, and that we have, don't forget, the nothing that of course hide part of the carbon nanotube surface. The decreased sensitivity, of course, reflects in a worst limit of detection, so our sensor is more blind. What's about electrodeposition? The sensitivity goes again up, so this is a good news, but the best was obtained with the chemical vapor deposition growth. The main true reason is that in this case we have no polymers, so all the surface of our carbon nanotube is available, and more, we have the carbon nanotube intimately electrically connected with our substrate, with our metals. So we have also a better electron transfer from the electrode to the carbon nanotubes. The best of the best we obtained on the uric acids, when we got almost, you see, 4-5 orders of magnitudes more than the case of microspotting. But don't forget that we have changed the molecule, and of course changing the molecule change the comparison. So what's about all the other issue? I apologize for who of you that is not lacking or loving the electronics or background, but now we will spend a bit of time on the CMOS design side. So for having a reliable measurements of the current, because we want to be reliable in order to have the possibility to even perform signal processing, one possibility is to implement some smart idea to detect precisely the current flowing through the electrochemical cells. Our sensors are basically a 3 electrode configuration electrochemical cell. As usual, we have to apply the right potential between the reference and the counter, and we can typically do that with a voltage follower, as in any solution, as in any circuit present in literature. Indeed, we can improve the current measurements, and instead of using, for example, transimpedance amplifier or current to voltage conversion, we can use a more smarter idea to convert the current in a frequency, and we will say that it will give us also further benefit. How to do it? We can develop a circuit like that. This is a good idea published by Narola and Aris in 2006. They mainly used VDD to charge a capacitor, and they monitor the charging of the capacitor by a reference. When the voltage across the capacitor overcomes the reference, of course the comparator switch, and we can use the switching of the comparator to put off this transistor and enable the the capacitor to discharge through our electrochemical cell. In this manner, the current at our working electrode, that don't forget is related to the redox reaction we have into the working electrode, will drive the timing of discharge of this capacitor. So, of course, we can once again monitor the discharge, switch the capacitor, and so at the end we will obtain a conversion of the current flowing through my electrochemical cell and the frequency in which counted by the counter, with which the comparator switch on and off. Of course, if we want to address different metabolites on the same platform, we can develop a bit more smart electrochemical cell facing different working electrode, one common counter and one common reference. So we can, of course, apply the right potential in different times. So we can create a kind of time modulation for acquiring the different working electrode, and use a common counter to convey the current emerging time by time from the different working. We can use a current mirror in order to convert this current to a common current to frequency converter, so we have only one current to frequency converter, and we can detect in this manner, we can multiplex different electrochemical sensors on the same platform. What's about temperature and pH? I promise you to show that if we want to target, for example, the position of the Faraday peak in our cyclic voltammograms, unfortunately, if we vary the pH, this peak shift in the potential. And if you pay attention on the scale here, we move, roughly speaking, from minus 370, roughly speaking, up to 470. No, more than 500 millivolts. So it's a huge variation of the potential. And if you recall the example of this cytochrome 2C9, the variation in distinguishing the clofenac and robustamides, for example, was 20-30 millivolts. So it's so important to take into account of the pH. The reason of that is, of course, that the Nernst equation has an explicit dependence on the pH, so we cannot cope with that. We can only measure the pH, mark the variation, and calibrate our sensor. The same is for the temperature. Both the Randall-Sedley equation and the Cottrell equation has an explicit dependence with the temperature. So once again, if our patients move from 36 up to 40 degrees, we have a significant variation of the current we measure. The current is typically directly related proportional to the concentration of our metabolites, and so we mix it up the real concentration. So we definitely need to measure pH and temperature. We integrated with the thin film technology just a resistor in platinum on the platform to realize the temperature sensor. Once we realize a junction just facing platinum and iridium dioxide in order to obtain a pH sensor, because this junction is very sensitive to the pH. This is just one experiment in which we acquired the open circuit potential just injecting in the solution NaOH in order to move from low to high pH, and then we injected again the chloride acids in order to move from high pH to low pH. And as you can see, the sensor registered quite well all this variation, and if we go the calibration curve, we see that they are extremely linear, both moving from acid to basic and moving from basic to acid. Something similar was obtained by measuring the resistance of the temperature sensor. So nothing special. We apply a potential, we measure a current, we use the Ohm law, and we get the temperature. And once again, at least in the case of temperature sensor and with a voltage to current conversion, also in the case of the pH sensor, we can at the end address and multiplex all our different sensors we have in the platform, not only the molecular but also for temperature and pH. We can use different first branches of the same current mirror in order to convey, once again in a kind of time modulation, all the emerging currents to the common second branch of the current mirror, and use once again a single current to frequency converter. Last but not least, we need to be reliable in potential sweep, because we promise to distinguish the different drugs in our sample. So we need to generate a voltage ramp on chip. Nothing special, that's an exercise of the bachelor to develop a voltage ramp by using a capacitor. We just have seen a few moments before for the current to frequency converter. However, the problem we met here is that we need to generate voltage ramp that move by 20 millivolts per second in order to cope with electrochemical measurements. So we are really sub-Earth, and this is extremely difficult to be done in an integrated, very thin chip. So if the target is to stay within 2 millimeters, we need to play with 2 picoampere of current in order to maintain very small the capacitor, and this is out of scale with the typical noise in IC, or we need to consider bigger capacitors that are bringing us out of specs. So we developed here a new idea. Another PhD student of mine, very smart, developed this idea of a direct digital synthesizer directly in chip. She simply used a phase accumulator to charge a phase register, and by using a proper clock, and then of course she discharged the phase register by using a digital to analog converter, and thanks to a low pass filtering she got the typical waveform that we use in electrochemistry. That's a mixed signal solution that seems to work quite well. Okay, this is the design of the second prototype, because as usual in the true story, the first prototype was not working. So we redesigned the prototype, and the second time we successfully succeeded on that. You can recognize an interface for our 5 working electrodes, the interface for the pH and for the temperature sensor, the system for generating the voltage ramp, the current to frequency converter, a simple circuit for measuring the opening potential for the pH, and a trivial block for measuring the resistance of temperature. The device has been realized in 1.5 for 1.5 millimeters, so that means 1 block in UNC 018 micrometer technology. This is one of the first photographs. You can see roughly how the chip and the underneath passive platform with the 5 molecular sensor. It's not easy, but here we have the pH sensor and just nearby the temperature sensor. And these are some tests we have done by comparing the typical lab equipment, which is even like that, and costs $40,000, with our integrated chip, which is 1 millimeter per 1 millimeter. And as you can see, we get a quite good correlation between the 2 measurements. We did it for a glucose, we did it also for lactate. In both the cases, these are chronon parameters, fixed potential measuring only a current that varies with the concentration. We obtained quite good correlation between the measured sensitivities, while we are worse as expected in the limit of detection, mainly due to the fact that we have more noise in our integrated potential stuff. We used our developed chip also for measuring drugs, typically for measuring cyclic voltammograms. You can recognize here the peak related to the drugs. We did it with up to now with 2 different drugs. This is the case of the etoposide, but we obtained similar results with the metaxtone and other anti-cancer compounds. And once again, we succeeded not exactly to obtain the same value, but to obtain similar value for the position of the peak in our cyclic voltammograms. The baby require 220 microwatts for a VDD of 1.8 volts. And now the question is where to go to harvesting this energy. Of course, the literature offers several possible alternatives, different solutions. After deep thinking with it, we decided to go for inductive coupling. Mainly the reason is that we found in literature, we already found in literature 4 years ago, a huge effort, worldwide effort in investigating the possibility to exploit the transmission of power by inductive link. The good news is we can reach by literature, by declaration read in literature, up to 36% in the efficiency of the link, and that not only simulations show that, but also real experiment, for example, done in dots. The bad news is that we need to stay very close. So in this experiment, 25 millimeter between the transmitting coil and the receiving coil, but for us it's not a limitation if we want to just have the patch on top of the region where we have implanted our device. The problem is that, of course, in all the published papers we have reasonable size also for the receiving coils. And what we have immediately observed is that if we go down with the lateral side of our receiving coil, our link efficiency and our voltage gain drop below unbelievable value. So the only chance we have to increase the link efficiency as well as the voltage gain is to increase the number of turns, but this enables us to lose the tiny lateral side of our device. So the solution was to try to develop the other turns not laterally but in the zeta direction in order to maintaining very small the lateral size of the device. Actually, we tried two different technologies. One was to realize a multi-layer in copper, realizing a PCB flexible platform, and the second trial was to design a metal antennas directly on silicon in order to have a deep integration with our silicon platform. In the second case, honestly speaking, we found a lot of problems to realize the multi-layer turn. So at the end, we ran for a single layer antennas, while it was really easy to obtain a multi-layer with the PCB state-of-the-art technology. This is just one of the first images from top of a multi-layer copper antenna realized on flexible PCB, and this is indeed one scanning electron micrograph of the realized antenna on silicon. We made measurements on air at different distances between the transmitting coil and the receiving one, and we repeated the experiment with quite good success, both with the multi-layer copper version and with the single layer on silicon. But the great difference is that, as expected in the first case, for 1 centimeter distance between the transmitting and receiving coil, we reached an efficiency of the link up to 40%, which is really extremely good, while in the second case the efficiency was only 1.4. So the first is for sure the better solution. We repeat the experiment not only in air with the best performing antenna, but also on tissue. We used a leaf stack to perform the experiment, and we succeeded in receiving up to 2 milliwatts by through 25 millimeter of bovine tissue, and of course if we decrease the distance down to 14 millimeter, we receive up to 3.6 milliwatt. A lot of room if we want to power our tiny chip, which requires only 230 microwatts. So it seems that it's really feasible to transmit power and so to develop a so complex device without any battery on board. We also check the efficiency of the link not only for power transmission but also for data transmission, and we achieve a quite good rate, 100 kilobits per second. Just to make a step back and to look again the big picture, as promised, we want to realize an inductive coupling between the powering system and our sensor. The sensor is indeed a multi-panel platform with different, both molecular and other kind of sensors. We can use the same current to frequency converter, and this gives us an extra benefit for the transmission of data, because of course the power Transmission is very efficient if we have an impedance matching between the first and the second net in the system. If we are out of the best match impedance condition, we are able to measure here this badly coupling between the first and the second net. So we can use the frequency out of our current to frequency converter to use a switch and to, in purpose, get out of matching the two networks. In that way, we obtain what it is called in literature the backscattering readout of our data. And thinking that we will measure here a frequency of in and out of the matching, which is related to the frequency of the converter, which is directly related to the current of our sensor, we are measuring here a frequency which is directly related to the measurement of the sensor in our implant. Of course, during the development, we also developed the patch, including, of course, lithium battery, data processing module. We was required to develop also an high efficiency class key power amplifier. We also made experiment by using not only the backscattering but also bidirectional ISK modulation, because in the third prototype that has been already built and that is under testing in these weeks, we also want to transmit data to the implant in order to provide programmability to the implant, to let the implant know, not necessarily to measure everything, but to know what to measure in which moment. And then, trivially, a Bluetooth system in order to provide a link to the mobile phone. This is just one sketch of the designed patch. You can recognize the Darlington configuration. The modulator that we have used for the ASK, that is controlled by a microcontroller on the patch. Then we have the aspected class C amplifier, the carrier generator, and the transmitting coil on the patch. This is one of the first photographs of the patch. You can clearly see here the transmitting coil, which is in centimeter size. We have no limitation in principle for a bandage or for a patch we can put on top of our skin, and you can clearly recognize the off-the-shelf chip for the Bluetooth communication. Last but not least, through a masterpiece, we also design a quite simple Android interface just to apply our cyclic voltammograms and our chronoamperometers on the screen of a smartphone. Because all of this looks like science fiction, we also get a bit of advertising on BBC, and then other journals refer to our magic development. What it is interesting of this page is that you can see the last step of the development, so the biocompatible packaging that we need to put surrounding our system, because we have mainly two highly toxic materials. Copper for the antenna, which is worldwide known that is very toxic for cells, and carbon nanotubes that are nanoscale material. Once again, not sure, it's still under debate, but in any case, they are considered highly toxic. So how to protect the optic body by our highly toxic electronics system? We developed a biocompatible packaging by using three different kinds of membranes. We use a parylene C to mainly protect our electronics by the body fluid, to protect corrosion by the body fluid. Then we develop a soft encapsulation by using a biocompatible silicon in order to create a packaging that should be soft enough in order to not induce pain and inflammation to the host body. This, of course, is not possible to be put all over everything, because the sensor needs to be in contact with the molecule we want to measure, while the silicon is not a porous material. So we open a windows and we use a polycarbonate membrane, which is biocompatible, commercially viable, but also is a porous membrane that allows our metabolites to penetrate the packaging and to reach contact with the sensor. This is one of the first photographs of the biocompatible packaging. You can easily recognize the molecular sensor the 1.1 per 1.1 millimeter IC and the silicon soft packaging surrounding them. We ran for experiment. We tested the different kind of part of the system, the biocompatible without wings, biocompatible with the wings, only the antenna, the whole system, and we tested with the mouse model by creating on the back of the poor animal an artificial patch by inflating air and implanting our chip inside. The experiment for biocompatibility stands for more than 1 month, and this is one of the results. We measure both ATP as one of the marker of the inflammation, as well as neutrophils that usually grow in the region of the inflammation. We tested several biochips, biocompatible platform. All of them have a small expression of ATP, but this case, that is probably due to the surgery, something was wrong with this animal during the surgery. We compare with a real induced by lipopolysaccharide inflammation. As you can see that this is a normal inflammation, almost including this one. All our chips are not inducing an inflammation, and they are really very close to the control that has been done by producing the air patch on the back of the mouse, but without implanting any other chip. We also have other data, other results that have been acquired by using a commercially viable microchip, typically used with our pet animals, and we get even with the commercially viable device, similar kind of inflammation. So it's just a proof that our biocompatible packaging has been quite successful in not inducing further inflammation to the animal. So in summary, in order to leave you to ask questions before the coffee breaks, I hope to succeed in showing you that we can use, although it's not so easy, although it's complex, we can use even other kind of enzymes like those of the cytochrome P450 in order to detect pharma compounds typically used in drug treatment in order to address personalized medicine with under-the-skin technology. Of course, as well as in the case of the glucose, commercially viable glucose, we can use oxidases to address several other endogenous metabolites typically related to the disease, lactate, glutamate, dopamine. We also see the case of ATP, which is not having an electrochemical active oxidase, but in any case we can find indirect electrochemical way to detect it. We have seen that we definitely need carbon nanotube, not necessarily in case of the oxidases, but in case of the drug measurements through cytochromes, we actually need carbon nanotube in order to succeed in fitting the therapeutic and pharmacological ranges of concentration in patients. We still need dedicated design because, of course, we need to develop a quite non-trivial electronics. So, for example, there are commercially viable off-the-shelf integrated potentiostat. We also used one of those in some of our experiments, but they are making basic electrochemical detection. If we want to play with a complex system and to introduce more intelligence in the chip, we definitely still need to develop our own electronics. Remote powering is definitely required if we want to be minimally invasive under the skin, but considering all of this together, it seems that we can really address the telemetry of the human metabolism directly on our smartphone. All of this seems to be difficult, but actually feasible. So, of course, if we let the electronics to stay under our skin, even without having consciousness about that, we need to take care. The Newsweek Times published in 2012, in May 2012, this nice article with this nice photograph in alerting us to be aware of the fact that the IT firm are big tech is becoming more and more powerful in monitoring us, and this may have also some drawbacks. And of course, being more corporate and less cool, IT firms are becoming as popular as banks. And from 2008 on, banks were not so popular worldwide. So this is just a message to say that, of course, we are developing super smart technology, but of course we need to take into account a lot of issues related to privacy, security, law, social behavior of humanity, and also culture. Okay, as you can imagine, I have to thank an enormous amount of people for all the results I showed you before. Mainly my PhD student, Andrea, Camilla, Christina, Sarah is the lady that designed the AC I showed you, while Irene is the lady succeeding in getting selectivity growth of carbon nanotube. And last but not least, Jack was the guy that developed the two smart antennas I showed you. Of course, I thanks all the people, students and colleagues that have been on this ride, and all of you for your kindly attention to this tutorial. If you, by chance, want to have some materials related to the tutorial, you can even drop me an email. I will be more than happy to answer you. So, with this I close with 10 minutes of delay. So, sorry about that. If you have any question, I'm more than happy to.
One quick question is, in terms of the clinically relevant data, when you're taking the glucose measurements and comparing them to the commercially available measurements, what was the biggest delta you ever saw between them?
In terms of what? Sensitivity?
In terms of, what is it? What we're going to deciliter, in terms of glucose, like clinically relevant measurements, were you seeing differences of, you know?
Well, honestly, we didn't done any comparison because we didn't find any major problems in measuring glucose. So we get sensitivity in the physiological range, so we are, let's say, in the same range than commercially available device. In terms of testability, we got the survival of our sensor up to 36, 38 days. So more than enough if you are targeting application and experiment for 1 month. So we didn't done because we didn't have, let's say, the competition with the glucometer in the market. Instead, what it was very challenging for us is to measure individuated drugs. And in this case, we're still not benchmark in the market. Yes?
I had a question about your packaging. So did you, just to clarify first, did you say that you had implanted the different versions of that packaging into the wrap for a month, and then you analyzed the information? Did you also look at device performance over that time, whether or not the period while being implanted, like essentially the effect of the packaging?
Good question. The experiment with using implanted device are still running, so we still do not have the performance of the device running in the mouse. So up to now, we only have the results on the biochar. Be back in 4 months. We are organizing the setup for having the remote powering. Meanwhile, the mouse is moving.
Will you submit this to the FDA with some classic device?
No.
And will a company try to make this commercially available? What are your next steps?
Yeah, exactly. Good, extremely good question. So we even didn't thought to use this kind of technology in humans, and so to run for the approval of stuff like that. What we are currently doing is that, thanks to a collaboration we have with a company that is developing, which is a European leader in continuous glucose monitoring, we are now running for application in intensive care unit patients. But in this case, we will not implant the device under the skin of the patient, but we will use the device online with commercially viable sampling tubing on critical patients. So the device will be not implanted, so from this perspective, we don't need any FDA approval. Of course, this is obtaining an FDA approval for a technology like that is a completely different story and more problematic. We have probably a question from the front.
one question left. So like if you want to implant the sensor like inside the body, you need a deep layer to cover the sensor.
Yeah.
Protect from the degradation from the
Yeah.
body. But for glucose, the time response is very important. So when you want to read like the actual glucose concentration, like if there is some delay,
Yeah.
the response to the sensor really may not be appropriate.
Okay.
So when you are using this like layer covering the sensor, I'm looking like a delay in the glucose response.
So to answer, the first is that this sampler, this chip has been developed to be located in the interstitial tissues. So the experiment that we are now planning with animals, the device will be collecting data from the tissues, the fat tissues just underneath the skin. And it is well known that there is a delay of 15 minutes between the value of the glucose in the blood and the value of the glucose in the interstitial tissues. In our packaging, we use the polycarbonate membrane, which is exactly the same material that is used in the commercially available device. And device that has been used to estimate this 15 minutes of delay in the wave in the blood with respect to wave in the tissue. So we are not expecting further delay with respect to what we already have with the commercially available device. Yes, on that.
So one of the problems with CMT and quantum control is when you get like a multi-metabolites, is that linear effect?
Using semiconductor or using metallic, you say? Okay. Okay. Now, what is the most important fact in improving the performance of our electrochemical sensor is not mainly the conductivity in the tube, but defects on the surface of the tube that in principle reduce the conductivity on the tubes, but it increases the electron transfer from the tube or to the tube. So don't forget that we need to extract electrons that are flying to the tube, or we need to inject, depending on if we are working on the redox Faraday current or the oxidation current. So we typically the carbon nanotube has, for example, growth. They are not enough good for us. We need to modify the surface of the tube with some acid to create several defects on the structure, and in this manner we obtain an efficient interface for the electrochemical measurement. Yes.
So in your chip, you going to fabricate the actual. And what method do you use for?
We made several prototypes with withdrawal, but at the end we shifted lactate.
Okay, so
And normally you use them in glucose detection.
yeah, and then when you grow CNT by PV, so how you can control it? If we already grow on the atom earlier, because CNT is soon we grow anywhere.
Okay. It was a balance between the materials that we use for the passivation and for the catalyst. This was one key of the protocol. Another key was the electrodeposition of the catalyst. Because as I showed in the case of the carbon nanotube, if you are electrodepositing, you can target the region of the platform when you want the catalyst, so you are just applying the potential only on that electrode. And by choosing the right passivation member, you are going to obtain a velocity. So it's a balance between the kind of material, the thickness of the passivation, and the method you use in the polymer. If you like, we just fill the application for the patents and the details are there, we can send you the document. And we also have now an already accepted paper on nanoscale that is 5 details from the protocol. It's not yet published, but already available on the internet. You can just look for our name on nanoscale and find the details of the protocol.
question, but it's almost impossible to answer. So we really have pain in quantifying the number of carbon nanotubes because they are statistically growth, so they have exactly the same length, the same thickness, the same diameter. We can develop methods to know how is the amount of carbon nanotubes in mass, but it's not easy to transfer in the number of carbon nanotubes. So we try to estimate the number of carbon nanotubes, but we found that there are so many unknown that it's not possible. So we work more with scanning electron micrographs in order to see the quality of these obtained surfaces. We have a lot of it was a rare distribution of carbon nanotubes, but only the qualitative pattern.
Sandro, since none of the organizers are here, in order not to take more of the break and delay the next talk, let's thank the speaker one more time.